Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book. We're in Season 05, Episode 05. We crack open Andrew Heywood's political theory, an introduction, to explore the very essence of political control. How do some gain the right to rule, and what happens when that right is questioned? Today we're taking a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of power, authority, and legitimacy in political theory. And these aren't just, dry academic terms. They're really the bedrock for understanding why societies function the way they do, why people obey, or sometimes, and this is crucial, why they don't obey those in charge, and how political systems truly operate beneath the surface. Our source material today, Heywood's book, it offers a brilliant roadmap for unpacking these complex, often kind of messy ideas.
It really does. And it's true. While power might seem straightforward on the surface, our source material notes it's actually bedeviled by the difficult task of defining it. The real political insight, I think, lies in that journey. From mere control, just raw power to accepted authority, and then eventually to full legitimacy. That's where the true political magic, or maybe manipulation, depending on your view, happens in any system, big or small. It's not just about who's holding the reins, is it? It's why we agree to let them.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit then, starting with power. When we think of power in, say, the natural sciences, it's often pretty simple force or energy, like a river carving a canyon. But in the social sciences, it's far more nuanced. It's about achieving a desired outcome, what we might call power to, the capacity to get something done. But for our purposes, especially when we talk politics, the critical idea is power over others. That's where things get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the text makes a really crucial distinction here between power and influence. Power in this political context, it's about making binding decisions. Think of a government minister enacting a new law. That's power. Influence, though, that's about affecting those decisions from the outside. It could be organized lobbying, maybe rational persuasion, or even subtle intimidation. It really makes you pause and consider. Is power always overt? Is it always intentional? Our source brings up advertising, for instance. Advertising promoting materialistic values. Now, maybe the advertisers just want to sell products, right? But aren't they exerting a kind of power by subtly shaping our desires, our perceptions of what's important?
That's a fascinating point, and it leads us straight into Stephen Luke's groundbreaking work on the three faces of power. He called power an essentially contested concept, meaning basically there's no single easy definition everyone agrees on. But his broad definition is pretty useful. If A gets B to do something A wants, but which B would not have chosen to do, power is being exercised. So what are these different faces? How do they help us understand power more deeply?
Right. So the first face is decision-making. This is the most visible kind of power. Its roots go back to thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who saw it simply as one agent, directly affecting another's behavior. Robert Dahl, in his famous study of New Haven, Connecticut, Who Governs, he really tried to test this empirically. He challenged the idea that there was always some single ruling elite pulling all the strings. Instead, he looked at actual decisions made in specific policy areas like education or urban renewal. And he found that different groups held sway in different domains. It wasn't one elite, but several. This led him to a more, pluralist view of power.
Okay, so different groups winning on different issues. Yet even Dahl's really careful work, it left some questions unanswered, isn't it? Like, what about the issues that never even make it to a vote, the things that don't even get discussed publicly?
Exactly. And that brings us perfectly to the second, more subtle face of power. This is agenda setting, or sometimes called non-decision making. Bachrach and Baratz were key here. They argued that power isn't just about what decisions get made, but also about creating barriers, sort of gatekeeping, to prevent certain issues from ever being publicly aired at all. As Schachtschneider memorably put it, some issues are organized into politics, while others are organized out.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. The source mentions how political parties might consistently avoid discussing, say, developing world debt or maybe the full scale of the environmental crisis. These issues just don't make the agenda. Or think about how interest groups operate. The text notes that groups representing the well-informed, the prosperous, the articulate, they often stand a better chance of shaping the political agenda. They can effectively keep other, perhaps equally important issues off the table.
So this second face often points towards a more elitist conclusion, right? It suggests that those already in power, the status quo defenders, have an advantage in keeping challenging issues quiet. But it's not always a fixed game, is it? Our source does offer a counterpoint.
That's right. It acknowledges that popular pressure can break through these barriers sometimes. Think about successful campaigns for welfare rights or environmental protection movements. These started outside the mainstream agenda but forced their way in.
Okay, so we have decision-making and agenda setting. What's the third phase? You said it was maybe the most insidious?
Yes. The third phase is thought control, and this one goes even deeper. It goes beyond what people say they want or what issues get discussed. It's about influencing, shaping, or even determining their very wants, as Stephen Lukes himself put it. It really digs into the idea that our ideas, our opinions, our preferences, they aren't formed in a vacuum. They're profoundly shaped by our social experiences, family, school, the media, our whole culture. Vance Packard wrote about this years ago in The Hidden Persuaders, looking at advertising, how it creates needs we didn't even know we had.
Right. And this is where the more radical perspectives really come into their own. Marxist analysis, for instance. It argues that dominant ideologies, like capitalism in Western societies, can create what Engels and Lenin called false consciousness. Basically, people might be prevented from recognizing their true interests or the extent of their exploitation because the system shapes their thinking. Marx and Engels famously stated the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. So even if you have free speech, the underlying narrative can be overwhelmingly powerful. And then you have thinkers like Michel Foucault exploring what he called discourses of power. These are like systems of social relations, practices, and language that assign meaning and identities who's an insider, who's an outsider. And these identities, these ways of seeing the world, they become internalized. Domination becomes unseen, almost feeling natural.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's a critical challenge to this radical view, and the source acknowledges it. If people's stated preferences are just delusions, just false consciousness, then how on earth do we determine their real interests? What's the objective standard? Who gets to decide? Luke's tried to tackle this. He suggested real interests are what they would want and prefer, were they able to make the choice if they were fully rational and autonomous. But as our source points out, this kind of begs the question, doesn't it? It just pushes the problem back. How do we define rational and autonomous without smuggling in our own biases? It's a really tough philosophical knot.
Okay, so we've really explored the different dimensions of raw power, who gets their way, who sets the rules of the game, and maybe even who shapes our deepest desires. But now let's shift gears slightly. Let's move from raw power to authority. Now, authority is definitely a form of power, but it's distinct, isn't it? Because it implies the right to influence others. It's supposedly based on a perceived moral obligation to obey, which feels very different from power that relies on persuasion, pressure, or just outright coercion. You might be forced to obey power, but authority suggests you should obey. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very good summary. Analytically, yes, they're distinct concepts. Power is about might, authority is about right. But in the real world, they often overlap significantly. Take a prime minister or a president. They have authority derived from, say, respect for their office, maybe party loyalty. But they also wield considerable power, the ability to reward supporters, punish dissenters, push through legislation. And think about the authority of the law itself. To maintain order, it's almost always backed by what the source calls the machinery of coercion, the police, the courts, the prisons. Without that underlying power, the authority of law can quickly crumble when challenged.
That's a crucial point. The source also makes a distinction I find really helpful, the difference between being in authority and being an authority. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, that's a useful clarification. To be in authority means you hold a specific position within some kind of established hierarchy. Think of a teacher in a classroom, a police officer on the beat, a government minister. Their power, their authority, comes directly from the office they hold. And ideally, it commands automatic obedience based on that role. But being an authority is different. That means you're recognized for having superior knowledge or expertise in a particular field. Like a leading scientist, a skilled doctor, a respected academic. People respect their views, they listen to their advice, but it doesn't necessarily demand automatic obedience in the same way.
Ah, okay. You listen to your doctor because you trust their expertise, not because they have the legal power to compel you.
Precisely. It's about recognized knowledge versus recognized position.
Got it. Now, when we talk about types of authority, we really have to bring in Max Weber. His work is foundational here. He offered those three influential ideal types, sort of pure models which he used to categorize different systems of domination based on why people obey.
Yes, Weber's typology is incredibly insightful. His first type is traditional authority. This is authority based on long-established customs and traditions. It's seen as legitimate simply because, well, It has always existed. It's the way things have always been done. Think about patriarchal family structures or gerontocracy rule by the elders. While it's largely faded as the primary form in modern industrial societies, you definitely still see remnants. The institution of monarchy, for instance, even in places like the UK, draws heavily on traditional authority. The source does note an interesting contrast with Confucianism here. While also hierarchical, Confucian authority is supposed to be grounded in moral excellence and benevolence, not just blind adherence to tradition.
Interesting nuance. Okay, what's the second type?
The second type is charismatic authority. This one is completely different. It's based entirely on the power of an individual's unique personality, their compelling charisma, which Weber saw as a gift of grace. This type of authority owes absolutely nothing to a person's status, tradition, or official office. It rests solely on the leader's perceived extraordinary personal qualities and their ability to make a direct, emotional, personal appeal to followers. Figures like Mussolini or Hitler are often cited as examples leaders who cultivated this kind of intense personal devotion, seeking power unbound by rules or tradition.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, how the source points out that this kind of charisma can even be, well, manufactured through carefully crafted media images, orchestrated rallies, what some call cults of personality. We saw that with leaders like Stalin or Mao Zedong, too.
Absolutely. It's not always a purely natural phenomenon. And perhaps because of this and its potential for manipulation, charismatic authority is often viewed with quite a bit of suspicion. It's frequently linked to authoritarianism and the demand for unquestioning obedience from followers. Because it's not bound by established rules or procedures, it carries the specter of total power, as the source puts it. Followers often aren't just obedient, they become disciples, believing the leader can transform their lives. This messianic quality, often seen in leaders promising radical change, demands total devotion and poses a significant threat to individual liberty because it operates outside the checks and balances of normal procedures.
A powerful and potentially dangerous form of authority, then. What about the third type?
Finally, Weber's third type is legal rational authority, and this is the form that really dominates modern societies. It operates through a framework of clearly defined rules. Think laws, constitutions, procedures. Crucially, the authority attaches entirely to the office and its legally defined powers, not to the specific person holding that office.
Right. So in a modern government, a president or prime minister has power because the Constitution grants it to the office of the president or prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
It's not based on their personal appeal, like charisma, or their family lineage, like traditional authority. It's about the position itself.
Exactly. The person is exercising the powers of the office, and when they leave that office, they leave the authority behind. Weber actually tended to favor this form, mainly because he saw it as more efficient and, importantly, less prone to arbitrary abuse compared to the other two types. It's predictable, it's rational. But he wasn't blind to its downsides. He also recognized its potential darker side. He worried about the relentless spread of bureaucracy creating a depersonalized, potentially inhuman social environment, an iron cage of rationality. Efficient, yes, but maybe cold and soulless.
That's a chilling thought, too. And just to quickly loop back, our source also mentions another way to categorize authority: de jure versus de facto. How does that fit in?
Right. De jure means authority that exists in law. It's formally recognized and legally constituted. De facto means authority that exists in practice or in fact, even if it's not legally established. Generally speaking, traditional and legal rational authority are typically de jure. They're rooted in established customs or laws. Charismatic authority, on the other hand, is often purely de facto. It stems entirely from the leader's personality and followers' belief in them, not from any formal legal right to rule.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. Now, it seems this whole concept of authority, despite its importance, is actually pretty controversial.
Oh, absolutely. As the source notes, it's a deeply controversial concept. It has strong defenders and equally strong detractors. On the defending side, you have thinkers going back to the social contract tradition. People like Thomas Hobbes argued that authority is essential to establish order and defend individual liberty from the chaos and violence of a hypothetical state of nature. Life without authority for Hobbes was nasty, brutish, and short. Most liberals agree that authority is necessary, but they generally argue it must arise from below, through the consent of the governed, and crucially, it must always be constrained by law and constitutional limits to protect freedom.
And the conservative view?
Conservatives often take a different tack. They tend to see authority more as a natural necessity, something that arises from above, like the natural authority of parents over children. For them, authority promotes social cohesion, provides guidance, and upholds traditional values. They're often critical of what they see as modern permissiveness for undermining necessary authority structures. And some political theorists, like Hannah Arendt, have issued stark warnings. She argued that the collapse of authority, the erosion of traditional norms and respect for institutions, leaves societies disoriented and dangerously vulnerable to the rise of totalitarian movements, like Nazism and Stalinism.
Okay, so those are the arguments for authority. What about the arguments against it? The detractors.
Well, the primary argument against authority is that it poses a fundamental threat to liberty. If authority demands obedience, often unquestioning obedience, then there seems to be an inherent trade-off. As the sphere of authority expands, the space for individual freedom and autonomy necessarily seems to shrink. And secondly, authority can be seen as a threat to reason and critical understanding. It can foster deference, discourage questioning, and lead to an abdication of responsibility, where people just do what they're told without thinking critically.
And this isn't just a theoretical concern, is it? The source mentions some pretty disturbing psychological studies.
Indeed. Wilhelm Reich, for example, tried to link authoritarian family structures to the rise of fascism. Adorno and his colleagues studied the authoritarian personality, and perhaps most famously, Stanley Milgram's controversial obedience experiments in the 1960s provided chilling evidence.
Can you remind us what Milgram found?
Milgram's experiments suggested that ordinary people, under the perceived authority of a figure in a lab coat, could be induced to inflict severe, potentially lethal electric shocks on another person simply because they were instructed to do so. It raised profound questions about the power of situational authority and how easily people can engage in, as the source puts it, inhuman behavior or barbaric fashion when obeying orders. It's a very sobering finding about the potential dark side of obedience to authority.
Definitely sobering. Okay, so we've moved from power, the raw ability to make someone do something, to authority, the perceived right to make someone do something. And let's turn to the final piece of this puzzle. Legitimacy. How does this fit in?
Legitimacy is often defined simply as rightfulness. It's that crucial, almost mystical quality that transforms naked power into rightful authority, as the text says. It's what aims to ensure obedience out of duty rather than because of fear. And this makes it absolutely vital for the stability and survival of any government in the long run.
And importantly, you said earlier that while individuals might have authority, it's usually political systems or regimes that we describe as being legitimate or illegitimate.
Exactly. It's about the perceived rightfulness of the entire system of rule. And right here, there's a core disagreement about what legitimacy actually is. Max Weber, coming from a sociological perspective, basically argued that a system is legitimate if people believe it's legitimate. For him, it was fundamentally about a subjective belief in the right to rule. If that belief exists, the system has legitimacy, regardless of the moral basis.
But political philosophers weren't satisfied with that.
No. Many philosophers, going back to Aristotle or Rousseau, seek a deeper moral or rational foundation. They argue that rule is only truly legitimate if it serves the common good, protects rights, or is based on something like the general will of the people. It has to be objectively justifiable, not just subjectively believed. David Beetham, for example, directly criticized Weber's view. He argued that defining legitimacy as just a belief is problematic because it allows powerful groups to essentially manufacture legitimacy through propaganda or manipulation. Beetham proposed 3 conditions for legitimacy. First, power must be exercised according to established rules, legality. Second, these rules must be justified by shared beliefs between the rulers and the ruled. And third, there must be evidence of consent from the governed. All 3 are needed.
Okay, so we have this tension between legitimacy as belief versus legitimacy as having a justifiable moral basis. How, then, do systems achieve legitimacy? The source seems to suggest 2 main paths or perspectives, from below versus from above.
That's right. The from below perspective, which is central to the liberal tradition, emphasizes constitutionalism and consent.
Tell us about constitutionalism first.
Okay. Constitutionalism is basically the idea of limited government. Government power is defined and constrained by a constitution, essentially, a set of higher rules that govern the government itself. This usually involves fragmenting power, perhaps through a separation of powers, like in the US, or guaranteeing individual freedoms in a Bill of Rights. Constitutions confer that legal rational authority we talked about earlier. But for a constitution to provide legitimacy, it needs to do more than just exist on paper. It has to genuinely reflect shared societal values and principles. Our source makes a great point here, noting that the constitutions of former Soviet bloc countries, despite looking democratic on paper, ultimately failed to gain true legitimacy because their underlying principles didn't resonate with or weren't practiced by those in power or believed by the populace.
And the other pillar of this from-below approach is consent.
Yes, consent. This idea has deep roots in social contract theory, going back to thinkers like John Locke and his notion of tacit consent, the idea that by living in a society and enjoying its protections, we implicitly agree to obey its laws. But for legitimacy in a modern democratic sense, most argue it needs to be more than just tacit. It requires active and voluntary participation from citizens. Meaningful, competitive elections are the key mechanism here in liberal democracies. They offer citizens a genuine choice and a way to authorize governments. This contrasts sharply with, say, the carefully managed, non-competitive elections sometimes seen in authoritarian states, which are more about demonstrating unity than conferring real legitimacy.
Okay, so that's legitimacy built from below through rules and participation. What about the from-above perspective? This sounds more critical.
It is. This perspective, often associated with radical and Marxist traditions, tends to view constitutionalism and democratic consent as potentially just a facade for underlying elite domination. Neo-Marxists like Ralph Miliband, for example, talked about capitalist democracies, arguing that even with democratic institutions, the system inherently serves the interests of private property and capital due to systemic biases. From this viewpoint, legitimacy isn't freely given from below. Instead, it's actively produced or manufactured from above through things like ideological manipulation and indoctrination.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the most obvious examples come from totalitarian regimes. Think of Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. They used official state ideologies, turned the media into pure propaganda outlets, rigorously censored opposing views, and used education systems to instill loyalty. That's overt manufacturing of consent.
But this critique isn't just limited to totalitarian states, is it?
No, proponents argue a similar, perhaps more subtle process happens even in liberal democracies. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist thinker, developed the concept of hegemony. Hegemony refers to the ideological and cultural domination of the ruling class. Their ideas, values, and beliefs become so pervasive in society through media, education, culture, religion, that they become accepted as common sense, even by those whose interests they might not serve. This creates that false consciousness we mentioned earlier, preventing subordinate groups, like the proletariat, from developing a clear understanding of their own situation or challenging the status quo. So even with formal free speech, the ruling ideas dominate.
It reminds me of the sociology of knowledge idea mentioned in the source too, the argument that all knowledge is socially constructed, shaped by our social position and experiences.
Exactly. Thinkers like Mannheim or Berger and Luckman, if all knowledge is socially situated, it implies that legitimacy itself might just be a social construction. And it casts doubt on the idea that individuals are purely rational actors capable of objectively judging the legitimacy of a system. We're all influenced by the dominant discourse.
And this ties into contemporary critiques of media too, doesn't it? Like Noam Chomsky.
Yes, Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model outlined in their book Manufacturing Consent. They argue that the very structure of mass media in capitalist societies, private ownership, reliance on advertising revenue, dependence on official sources, agents of power, and dominant ideologies creates inherent filters that systematically distort the news. The result, they claim, is that media often end up serving elite interests and effectively subverting democracy by limiting the range of acceptable debate and manufacturing consent for government policies.
Though, as you mentioned, it's important to note the criticisms of Chomsky's model, too, that it might be too deterministic, perhaps underestimating the diversity of views that do get aired, or the audience's ability to see through potential bias.
True, it's a debated model, but it powerfully illustrates that from above critique of how legitimacy might be constructed rather than simply earned.
Okay, so if legitimacy is so crucial, what happens when it breaks down? The source talks about legitimation crises.
Right.
A legitimation crisis occurs when a regime's legitimacy is seriously called into question and ultimately collapses. And this is critical because, as the source powerfully states, no regime has so far endured permanently through the exercise of coercion alone. Force can work in the short term, but eventually rulers need belief, they need acceptance, they need legitimacy. Jürgen Habermas, a key thinker here, identified potential crisis tendencies inherent in modern liberal democracies. He saw a fundamental tension between the demands of a capitalist economy, profit accumulation, and the demands of a democratic political system, welfare, equality, participation. Governments try to respond to popular democratic demands for more services, more security, but this can lead to what Anthony King called government overload. Meeting these demands can strain the capitalist economy, potentially undermining business confidence or leading to inflation. This forces governments into a difficult bind. Either resist democratic pressures, risking a political legitimation crisis, or potentially trigger an economic crisis.
Were these fears of crisis overblown, especially in the West?
In some ways, perhaps. Habermas himself later acknowledged that electoral mechanisms and political adjustments allowed Western democracies to manage these tensions better than initially predicted.
But the concept still has relevance.
Absolutely. For instance, the rise of the new right figures like Thatcher and Reagan in the 1970s and 80s can be interpreted as a direct response to a perceived legitimation crisis of the welfare state. Their project involved deliberately lowering public expectations of what government could or should do, shifting responsibilities back towards the market and the individual. It was arguably a conscious, hegemonic project aimed at changing the dominant political culture and restoring faith in a different model of governance.
And we've seen more dramatic examples, too.
Oh, definitely. The source mentions the significant challenges faced by many democratic governments in the developing world, often grappling with deep structural economic problems and struggling to meet the high expectations that came with independence or democratization. Failure to deliver can quickly erode legitimacy. But the most stunning, undeniable example in recent history has to be the collapse of the orthodox communist regimes across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. These were classic cases of profound legitimation crises across multiple fronts: political, lack of freedom, unresponsive parties, economic inefficiency, shortages, and social cynicism, loss of faith in the ideology. Citizens simply stopped believing in the system's right to rule, and eventually, despite the coercive apparatus, the regimes crumbled.
It really underscores how vital that belief, that legitimacy, ultimately is. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed from defining raw power and its often hidden faces, to understanding how that power gets transformed into accepted authority based on a perceived right to rule. And finally, landing on the absolutely critical role of legitimacy in ensuring a political system actually endures, or, as we just discussed, spectacularly collapses when that legitimacy fails. Understanding these fundamental concepts, power, authority, legitimacy, it really isn't just about academic theory, is it? It truly helps us, helps you, the listener, critically assess the world around us, the news we consume, the actions of leaders, the stability of governments.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on that idea of manufactured consent and legitimation crises we just touched on. If, as some of these more radical thinkers suggest, legitimacy is often, or at least sometimes, manufactured, and if our very wants, our preferences can be subtly shaped by power, then it raises a really profound question: what truly constitutes our real interests? And how can we as citizens ever confidently identify when a system genuinely earns our obedience through legitimate means versus when it merely commands it through power, manipulation, or manufactured consent? That's a challenge for all of us, I think.
That is definitely food for thought. A challenging question indeed. So keep digging into political theory, keep questioning, and keep observing how these powerful concepts play out every day in real-world events. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.